Hey everyone, today we are going to be finally moving into World War II. We've been talking a lot about the years in between World War I and World War II. And so some of these causes may not seem like they're hitting you out of left field, so to speak. But it's important to sort of talk about these things so that we can get back on the right track for the causes of World War II once again. So, with World War II, we have the deadliest conflict in human history. So, when I started off talking about World War One, I talked about that as one of the deadliest conflicts in world history, only to be surpassed by World War II. And this erupted in 1939 due to a various number of, or a variety of political, economic, and military factors. However, Nazi Germany really is at the center of this particular story because Hitler is going to be the one that, at least in Europe, really inflames tensions and does aggressive actions that lead us into the Second World War. So, in terms of the main causes of World War II, not to be confused with the main causes of World War I, we have the Treaty of Versailles. We have the failure of the League of Nations. We have expansionist policies of totalitarian regimes. And then we have the policy of appeasement, which I will talk about in a second. So starting off with the Treaty of Versailles, we've talked about this so much over the last couple of units, but signed in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, of course, ends World War I, but it also imposed really harsh penalties on Germany. We've talked about this so much. Heavy reparations, about 33 billion in today's money, which weakened the German economy. Territorial losses reduced Germany's land, its resources, its influence. The war guilt clause embarrassed and humiliated Germany and its people and fueled nationalist resentment as they felt like they were singled out from the world. And all of these harsh terms sort of created a lot of economic instability and political unrest that leads the way to Adolf Hitler rising to power. But outside of Germany, you have a couple other countries who are doing similar things. Italy and Japan are on the winning side in World War I. However, they felt like they did not receive what they were either promised or they did not receive the respect they felt they deserved for aiding the Allied powers to win the war. And so you have these three countries that are now leading the way towards this sort of aggressiveness that we're going to be seeing. Now, on top of that, you have the failure of the League of Nations, which again was created in the aftermath of World War I and was established in order to prevent future conflicts. If you have everyone at the table, maybe we have better diplomacy and we have a lead up to ending wars in the future. However, the League of Nations was ineffective in a couple different ways, which will lead to the Second World War. So for one, you have a lack of enforcement. They have no military force to back their decisions. So basically, anytime a bad actor like Nazi Germany or later Japan ends up doing something that needs to be fixed, then you will have no power to back up those decisions. You also have an absence of key nations. So for one, the US never joined the League of Nations, and this weakened its overall authority because one of the strongest countries was not a part of it. And then there's an inability to stop aggression, and this is tied to the other two, but it helps to, helps in failing to respond effectively to acts of expansion that are going to take place from Germany, Italy, and Japan. Now, a huge part of this is the rise of totalitarianism that we talked about before. And these totalitarian regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan specifically really prioritize not only nationalism, but especially military strength and territorial expansion. And this is going to put them right in line with the sort of conflicts that are going to lead to greater amounts of war. So these governments ended up rejecting diplomacy in favor of military aggression to achieve their goals. and this is going to lead to these other conflicts with other nations. It's also going to undermine global stability. It's going to directly contribute to the outbreak of World War II as well. Now, in terms of Nazi Germany, we're going to focus on each of the three countries, but in terms of Nazi Germany, Hitler's aims were to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, which again, him and other Germans blame for Germany's current state, expand German territory, what he called Lebensraum, which translates in German to, or in English, to living space, and to promote Aryan supremacy. And so part of that was showing off the military might of Germany in order to prove these myths that he had created and others had created about Germany. So in terms of actions that Germany takes, it ends up withdrawing from the League of Nations in 1933. It ends up rebuilding its military, which we've already talked about is in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. 1936, they end up reoccupying the Rhineland, which was a portion of Germany that was basically taken over by the British and the French. And this also defies the treaty. In 1938, there is an Anschluss, which is a union with Austria. So basically, Nazi Germany de facto takes over Austria without opposition. And then in 1938, the British and the French, who we'll talk about as not wanting to go to war, they basically agree to something called the Munich Agreement. And this allowed Germany to take a portion of Czechoslovakia known as the Sudetenland. And the Sudetenland was mostly German-born citizens that were living in this part of Czechoslovakia, but it was still part of the country of Czechoslovakia. And this was done to appease Hitler, to basically stop him from going to war with them, which they did not necessarily want. And in agreement, Hitler was going to not invade the rest of Czechoslovakia and just limit it to this portion of Czechoslovakia. But in 1939, Germany ends up invading the rest of Czechoslovakia, and so this sort of reveals Hitler's true intentions. Also in 1939, you have the Nazi-Soviet Pact. So in the First World War, Germany ends up attacking Russia, or what becomes known as the Soviet Union. And so in order to not be attacked from both sides, Hitler signs this pact with Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union in order to basically stop them from being attacked both from the east by the Soviet Union and from the west by Britain and France. And so this pushes him to invade Poland, and that is going to be the ultimate thing that leads to the World War II. Now, in terms of Italy, Italy is also doing its own expansions. So Mussolini is seeking to revive the glory of the Roman Empire. We talked about this when you guys saw the video a few weeks ago. But in 1935, Italy ends up invading Ethiopia, which is in Africa. And this defies the League of Nations, which did not want Italy to take over this independent country. In 1939, Italy invades Albania, which is in Europe. Eastern Europe, and this demonstrates continued expansionist policies. And then in 1939, Mussolini ends up signing what is called the Pact of Steel, and this is with Hitler and Nazi Germany, and it basically ties Italy and Nazi Germany together as allies, and if someone attacks Germany, then Italy is going to become involved. So some of the same things that were leading to World War I in terms of the alliance system are starting to come to fruition once again. Now, Japan is one that we have not talked about as much, but Japan in Asia is as significant a player in the start of World War II as anyone, because Japan is aiming to pursue imperial expansion. They want to expand their empire, to secure natural resources, and to also establish itself as a world power, to gain respect, which is something they felt like they did not get in the negotiations for the Treaty of Versailles, where they were sort of treated in a racist fashion as beneath the Europeans. And so, led by Emperor Hirohito and General Hideki Tojo, they end up trying to increase Japan's military and expansionist policies. And this leads them first into China, where they invade Manchuria, which is a region of China, and we'll talk more about that in just a second. And this led to international condemnation, but no real consequences. And then in 1937, Japan decides to invade all of China in what is called the Second Sino-Japanese War, and this resulted in many atrocities where the Japanese army carried out, just very brutalistic warfare. And this continues into 1940, where Japan ends up joining Germany and Italy to form what is called the Tripartite Pact. And this also becomes known as the Axis powers, and that's how they will be known throughout World War II. Now, further expansion into Southeast Asia in places like Korea and the Philippines ends up leading to conflict with the U.S., and that's where we will become involved in late 1941. Now, in terms of Manchuria, like I said before, was a region that is in northeast China, so very close to Japan. And this was rich in natural resources. It was also strategically important because of its closeness not only to Japan, but also as a buffer against Russia, who Japan had, or the Soviet Union, I should say, who Japan had run-ins with over the previous 40 years. And after the First Sino-Japanese War that took place in the 1890s, Japan had gained control over Taiwan. They had also secured significant influence in the Korean Peninsula. And by the 1930s, Japan was facing economic challenges just like the rest of the world because of the Great Depression. And so this pushes them and fuels nationalistic sentiments to continue to expand. Japan is an island, which means that they don't necessarily have the abundance of natural resources that other mainland countries might. And so they had to figure out ways to expand that. So the invasion of Manchuria ends up starting in the 1930s, in 1931 in particular, when Japanese military leaders fabricated an incident known as the Mukden Incident. And they claim that Chinese troops had basically sabotaged a railway that was important to the Japanese. And so they used this fake, sort of story, this misinformation, this propaganda to attack Manchuria. And this incident ends up leading to, within months, the Japanese forces taking control of the region, and they established what is called a puppet state known as Manchukuo. And Manchukuo, or a puppet state, is basically when a government appears independent, but basically it's being run by Japan. Even though they're presenting it like it's a independent nation, it's taking its orders from Japan. So in response to the invasion of Manchuria, this really drew a lot of condemnation from the world, but the responses were largely ineffective. In 1933, the League of Nations ended up condemning Japan's actions. They called for a withdrawal of its troops from Manchuria, but as we talked about, the League of Nations had no way to actually enforce that. And so Japan just ignores the demands, they withdraw from the League of Nations, and they end up showing their disregard for the international norms that had been set up after World War I, and really highlighting the limitations of that sort of collective security if there's no teeth to sort of back it up. And so this, again, is setting the stage for future conflict, not only in Europe, but also in Asia as well. And with the Second Sino-Japanese War, this was another action. Again, we talked about it starting in 1937, when they try to invade all of China, and this starts in July of 1937 with a skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge, and this is near Beijing, China, which is now the capital of China. And this escalated into a full-scale conflict between China and Japan. And this ends up being a very brutal war. It involves significant civilian casualties where civilians are being attacked by the Japanese. It includes widespread atrocities, including the use of chemical warfare and employing tactics like aerial bombardment of cities, so using airplanes. And this really results in immense suffering for the Chinese population. And so included in these particular atrocities is one in particular, which is known as the Nanjing Massacre. And this takes place in December of 1937. And after Japanese soldiers capture Nanjing, which was at that time the capital of China, they end up, committing a lot of different atrocities where many civilians were killed. Countless others were subjected to other acts of violence that targeted civilians, including women and children being attacked as well. And so this really, leads and shows the brutality of the Japanese army and military at this time. And this had really profound implications in the future for both China and for the world in total. So for China, it really marked a crucial turning point. To this point, they had largely been isolated. They, really did not have a strong military because they were not aiming to sort of deal in the same ways with the world. However, they end up turning towards fighting against this foreign domination that keeps happening and to have a greater sense of sort of self-determination in a lot of ways and self-sufficiency. And this is for better and worse because it's later going to lead to the communist revolution in China. But the war also united various factions for a time at least, including the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek and the communists under Mao Zedong, who temporarily were able to set aside their differences in order to resist that Japanese aggression. Now, globally, as World War II escalated, the conflict in China became sort of intertwined in World War II as well. And it sort of put the United States and Japan on a crash course for conflict with each other. Because as they continued expanding, they started to encroach on U.S. territory in Southeast Asia. Now, as big of a factor as any is the policy of appeasement that was carried out mostly by Britain and France, but by a large majority of the world. And this takes us back into Europe because this centers directly on Hitler and his expansionist activities. So Britain and France, which was weakened by World War I and did not really have the stomach for going to war in such a big way, wanted to seek to avoid another war. And so they had this policy of appeasement where you basically make concessions to someone saying, hey, like, if you stop here, I won't attack you, but you can have until you come, to this point. However, they really underestimated what Hitler was trying to do in terms of taking over every territory that he could. And so for someone like Hitler, they weren't just going to stop at a certain point. They were going to continue going. And so some examples of appeasement include in 1935, Britain signed with Germany the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, which allowed Germany to rebuild its navy. So again, rearming itself. In 1938, the Munich Agreement gave Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for a false promise of peace. This was negotiated by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, who, when he returned to Britain, as we can see in the picture here, held up that signed agreement, felt like they were avoiding peace. This was something that was celebrated in the moment, but ultimately ended up showing, the Allies as being weak and sort of naive because they thought that Hitler could be dealt with in a, sort of light manner. But then in 1939, after Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, Britain and France finally come to the realization that appeasement had basically failed. And so this leads directly into war. Because appeasement, because Britain and France did not stop Hitler earlier, it sort of made war inevitable. At every turn, Hitler basically thought that the Allies might fight back a little bit more than they were, and because they weren't, it continued his process going and going and going, and allowed him to gain steam on the international stage. And so this emboldened Hitler. It made war inevitable, like I said. And this directly leads into the final event that is going to lead to war, and that is the invasion of Poland. So on September 1st, 1939, Germany starts to invade Poland. And this is after Hitler signed the Nazi-Soviet pact with Russia, where they basically agreed not to attack each other, the non-aggression pact. But after Germany invades Poland, Britain and France, finally realizing that Hitler would not stop expanding and disregarding their treaties, declared war on Germany 2 days later on September 3rd, 1939. And so in conclusion, World War II was caused by a combination of unresolved issues from World War I, as well as ineffective international diplomacy and appeasement, aggressive totalitarian regimes, and those failed attempts to maintain peace in a diplomatic fashion. And so knowing how to analyze these consequences really helps to look at the power of unchecked aggression and needing to do something in order to stop aggressive countries from continuing to attack. And this is a lesson that we have even to this day, especially when we think about Vladimir Putin and Russia and the response to these sort of actions. All right, if you have any questions, let me know. But other than that, I hope everyone has a fantastic day.